Gosh, Annie, I don't see how you manage to hit it every time.
That's easy, Tag. Once you learn to see just the bullseye and nothing else, then all you have to do is point your gun at it and pull the trigger.
A cowboy should never tell a lie. A cowboy must always tell the truth. A cowboy should keep himself clean in thought, word, deed, and personal habits. A cowboy must respect women, parents, and the laws of his nation. A cowboy is a patriot. Those were the rules. Gene Autry wrote them himself. He handed them to every child in America who ever listened to his radio show, watched his movies, or played with the toy cap guns that carried his name. Millions of kids memorized those rules. They believed every word. And honestly, why wouldn't they? Gene Autry was the cleanest, safest, most trustworthy man on any screen in America. White hat, beautiful horse, songs about home and mothers and faith. He smiled, and the whole country smiled right along with him. He was the cowboy hero you could leave your children alone with and never think twice. But here is what those children never found out. Here is what the audiences sitting in dark theaters never once suspected. Here is what even his own wife tried her best to ignore for years and years and years. The man who told America's kids to be clean in thought and action was living a private life that would have shattered the cowboy image overnight if the full truth had surfaced when it actually mattered. There was an affair, a long one, not a mistake, not a moment of weakness, years. There was drinking, real drinking, the kind that costs you sponsors and puts you flat on your back in front of a live audience. There was a marriage that lasted close to 5 decades and produced no children and carried a silence so heavy it could fill an entire room. And right in the center of the most talked about chapter of his hidden story stood a woman named Gail Davis. She was not some unknown figure lurking in the background. She was the star of one of his biggest television shows. She was Annie Oakley on screen and off screen. According to the accounts that came out later, she was the woman Gene Autry pursued until a relationship took hold that lasted for years. So today, we are not going to start at the beginning and walk through dates like a history textbook. We are going to start with the image, the perfect, polished, untouchable image that Gene Autry spent decades building. Then we are going to watch it crack, slowly, piece by piece, and once those cracks are wide enough to see through, we are going to go back and ask a harder question. Why did he need that image so desperately in the first place? What was he running from? And what did all of it cost the people who loved him the most? Stay with me on this one. The story is not what you think. The man who could do no wrong. Before we get into the messy parts of Gene Autry's private life, you really need to understand just how enormous his public image was. Because this was not regular Hollywood fame. This was something else entirely. Gene Autry was not just popular, he was trusted. And there is a massive difference between those two things. Between 1934 and 1953, the man appeared in 93 motion pictures. Let that sit for a moment. 93 films, almost all of them westerns. And in nearly every single one, he played a version of himself. Not a dark, complicated character wrestling with inner demons. Just Gene, a good man sitting tall on a good horse, doing the right thing, singing a song before the credits rolled. Children watched those movies and walked out of theaters believing that this was exactly what a real man was supposed to look like. From 1936 well into the 1950s, Gene showed up year after year in the polls listing the top money-making Western stars. He did not hover around 3rd or 4th place either. For years he was number 1, and across all film genres, not just Westerns, he ranked among the top money-making stars in the entire industry from 1940. Think about what that actually means. During an era when Hollywood was filled with some of the greatest names in cinema history, a singing cowboy from rural Oklahoma was outperforming many of them at the box office. His radio career made his presence in American homes even more personal. From 1940 to 1956, Gene hosted a CBS show called Gene Autry's Melody Ranch. Every week, families gathered around the radio and invited his voice into their living rooms like a trusted friend. It was during this show that he introduced the Cowboy Code. That list of rules became a kind of moral compass for an entire generation of young listeners. Be honest, be brave, help people who are in trouble, respect women, obey the law, stay clean in thought and action, be patriotic, simple rules, the kind a child could memorize on a Sunday evening and still remember 60 years later. And they did remember, people still remember. Then came the music. Gene recorded approximately 635 songs across his career. Some of them did not just become hits, they became part of the permanent fabric of American life. In 1949, he recorded Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and it became one of the best-selling holiday songs in history. He recorded Here Comes Santa Claus after riding as Grand Marshal in the 1946 Santa Claus Lane Parade in Hollywood. During the parade, crowds along the route kept yelling those exact words, and Gene took that moment and turned it into a song. He recorded it in 1947, and the whole country fell in love with it overnight. Then came Frosty the Snowman. Then Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Then Up on the Housetop. Gene Autry did not simply sing Christmas songs. He became Christmas for an entire generation. Every single December, his voice came back. No scandal, no controversy, no uncomfortable questions. Just warmth and nostalgia, and the feeling that everything was going to be all right. Then add television, toys, and comic books. Starting in 1950, Gene produced and starred in the Gene Autry Show on CBS. His horse Champion had its own series. His face appeared on toy cap guns made by the Kenton Hardware Company. By 1939, 2 million of those little guns had been sold. 2 million in the hands of children. Playing cowboy, playing Gene. His name ran through Dell comic books for years, and a Mexican publisher later released 423 separate issues stretching from 1954 all the way to 1984. And then there was one detail that no other entertainer in history has ever matched. Gene Autry earned 5 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, 1 for radio, 1 for recording, 1 for motion pictures, 1 for television, 1 for live performance. Nobody else has done that. Not before him. Not since. So before we go any further, sit with that. This was a man woven into the childhood memories, the holiday traditions, the moral compass, and the daily entertainment of an entire nation. That was the image. Beautiful, wasn't it? Now, let us watch it crack. The cracks nobody talked about. The first crack did not come with a newspaper headline or a studio scandal. It came from a bottle. Quietly, at first, then not so quietly. Gene Autry had a drinking problem, and this was not something whispered only by jealous rivals or tabloid writers looking for cheap gossip. People who worked alongside him, people who genuinely liked and respected the man, they saw it too. And eventually it cost him something very public. His radio show Melody Ranch had a major sponsor at the time, Wrigley's Gum. That was one of the biggest names in American advertising. According to later accounts, Gene showing up drunk led Wrigley's to pull their sponsorship entirely. Now, that is not a small thing. Losing a sponsor of that size meant that somebody sitting in a boardroom at the top of a major corporation looked at Gene Autry and decided that the cowboy image was no longer a safe bet. That the risk of association had become greater than the reward. But the moment that really became impossible to hide happened in 1956. Gene was performing live. Howard Cable later recalled a particular show where Gene entered the arena riding Champion while singing Back in the Saddle Again, one of his most beloved songs. The audience was waiting, the music was playing, the spotlight was on, and Gene fell off the horse. Not because Champion bucked, not because of some freak accident. He fell because he could not stay upright, right there, in front of a live audience, an audience full of families, full of mothers who had brought their children specifically to see the cowboy hero they had grown up trusting. Those mothers complained, and they had every right to. Producer Jack Arthur reportedly went backstage and tore into Gene, calling the whole thing disgraceful. Gene did not argue, he did not make excuses, and later on, he reportedly thanked Jack Arthur for that moment, saying it helped turn his life around. But the damage from that night was already done. Not to his career, miraculously, because the machine of his fame somehow kept grinding forward. The damage was to the illusion. Because if you were sitting in that audience, if you brought your child to see the man who told kids to be clean in thought and action, and you watched him tumble sideways off a horse because he had been drinking, then you saw something you could never unsee. So the drinking was one crack, a real and visible one. But it was not the deepest crack. The deepest one had a name. Gail Davis and the affair behind Annie Oakley. Gail Davis was born Betty Jean Grayson on October 5, 1925 in Little Rock, Arkansas. She grew up first in McGehee before her family settled back in Little Rock. Her father was a small-town physician, and Gail was not somebody who stumbled into show business by accident or luck. She had been singing and dancing since she was a little girl. Performing was in her blood long before any camera ever pointed her way. After finishing high school, she attended Harcum Junior College for Girls in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. She later completed her education at the University of Texas at Austin. By the time Hollywood took notice, Gail was already polished. She had formal training, she had presence, she had the kind of natural ability that made people in the industry sit up and pay attention. Over her career, she appeared in more than 31 feature films, but the role that turned her into a household name was Annie Oakley. The television series ran through the 1950s, and it made Gail Davis one of the most recognizable women in all of Western entertainment. She was tough on screen, she was charming, she looked natural holding a rifle, kids loved her, families loved her, and Gene Autry produced the show. He did not just sign a check and walk away either. He called her the perfect Western actress. Now pay attention to those words. Not a talented actress, not a strong performer, the perfect Western actress. That kind of praise from a man as powerful as Gene Autry carried real weight. It meant he had studied her carefully. It meant he saw something in her that he genuinely believed no one else could match. To the public, their relationship looked completely clean. Producer and star, boss and employee. The powerful cowboy entertainer supporting a talented younger actress on a major television project. Everything about it seemed professional and respectable. Nothing to raise an eyebrow over. But according to accounts that surfaced later, the relationship between Gene Autry and Gail Davis went far beyond anything professional. During Gene's long marriage to his first wife, Ina May, stories described a sustained affair between Gene and Gail. Not a brief encounter, not a single night of poor judgment that could be quietly forgiven and forgotten. One source described Gene's active pursuit of his co-star and said the relationship lasted several years. Several years. And the phrase used to describe how his wife felt about it was to the chagrin of his wife. That word chagrin carries a lot of weight when you think about it. It means Ina May knew, or at the very least, she felt it, she suspected, she sensed the shift. She carried the burden of it silently while her husband continued to stand in front of cameras wearing that white hat, smiling for the public, telling children to keep their word and respect women. The man who sang about home and family and faith on every screen in America was living a double life off screen. The man who gave children a moral code was breaking it behind closed doors. And the woman involved was not hidden away somewhere out of sight. She was on television every single week, playing a hero, a sharpshooter, a role model for young girls, while privately tangled in a relationship with the very man who had put her there. That was the crack that mattered most. Not because affairs are uncommon in Hollywood, they have always been part of that world. It mattered because Gene Autry's entire value, his entire brand, his entire reason for existing in the public eye was built on the promise that he was different from other men in that business. He was the safe one, the clean one, the one who actually meant what he sang about. And if that was not true, then the whole cowboy image was just another performance, just another role played for money and applause, just another beautiful lie wearing a very expensive white hat. So why did Gail stay? Here is the part of this story that almost everyone skips over. They focus on Gene, his image, his hypocrisy, his fall from the pedestal. But Gail Davis was not a background character in this chapter. She was a trained, educated, talented actress with a career that existed on its own merits. She had options. She had a brain. She had ambition that did not depend on any single man. So why did she stay in a relationship with a married man for years? The answer, honestly, is more tangled than people usually want to hear. Gene Autry was not just a man, he was an entire universe. If you were inside his orbit, doors opened that stayed locked for everyone else. He produced television shows. He owned production companies. He controlled who got screen time and who vanished without a trace. Flying A Productions was the machine behind both the Gene Autry Show and Annie Oakley. And Gail's biggest role, the one that made her famous, only existed because Gene created it. He funded it. He chose her. He built the show around her talent. Put yourself in her position. You have trained your whole life. You have paid your dues. And then the most powerful man in Western entertainment tells you that you are perfect. He gives you national visibility that most actresses of the 1950s could only dream about. Now try drawing a clean line between gratitude and something deeper, between professional loyalty and emotional dependence, between admiration and something you cannot walk away from, even when part of you knows it is wrong. I am not saying any of this to excuse what happened. An affair is an affair, but it explains why these situations are never as simple and clean as they look from a comfortable distance. Gail Davis was caught in a world where the man who could make or break her entire career was also the man who had entered her private life. Walking away from Gene would have meant walking away from everything he controlled. And in 1950s Hollywood, A woman who walked away from a powerful producer did not usually get a second chance. The phone just stopped ringing. So Gail stayed. The affair continued, and the silence around it held firm, because every single person involved had something enormous to lose if the truth came out publicly. Gene would lose the family image that made him worth millions. Gail would lose the career he had built for her. And Ina May would lose the dignity of a marriage she had invested nearly her entire adult life in. Everyone was trapped inside the same lie, and the Cowboy Code just hung there on the wall like a set of instructions written for a world that never really existed. The woman who saw everything first, before there was Gail, before there was Hollywood, before the first camera ever rolled, there was Ina May. And if you want to understand Gene Autry's private world, you have to understand the woman who stood beside him back when he was still a nobody, with a guitar and a dream. Ina May Spivey was 21 years old when she met Gene. It was early 1932. Gene was on the road for work and stopped to visit his musical partner Jimmy Long in Springfield, Missouri. Ina May was Jimmy's niece. She came from Duncan, Oklahoma, and she wanted to be a music teacher. She had her own plans, her own direction, her own idea of what her life was going to look like. Gene was around 24 at the time. He met her and fell hard. Almost immediately, he started telling people he was going to marry this woman. After a short courtship, they eloped on April 1, 1932 in St. Louis. And because it happened to be April Fool's Day, some people who heard the news genuinely thought it was a prank. But it was no joke. Ina May Spivey became Ina May Autry. And from that day forward, her entire life became woven into his story, whether she wanted it to be or not. What most fans never realized is just how deeply Ina May shaped his career during some of its most important turning points. In 1934, she encouraged him to take the leap toward Hollywood. That single piece of advice changed the entire course of his life. Without it, Gene might have stayed on the radio and touring circuit for years, doing well enough but never reaching the kind of fame that motion pictures delivered. Ina May saw the bigger picture, when Gene himself might not have. Then came an even more important moment. In 1949, someone offered Gene a novelty Christmas song called Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Gene was not enthusiastic. He hesitated. He was not sure it matched his image or his style. It was Ina May who encouraged him to just go ahead and record it. That one decision turned out to be arguably the most significant of his entire music career. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer became a massive hit. It opened the floodgates for all the other Christmas recordings that followed. Here Comes Santa Claus, Frosty the Snowman, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Up on the Housetop. The fact that Gene Autry became synonymous with Christmas in America, that he became as much a part of the holiday season as decorated trees and wrapped presents, can be traced directly back to his wife pushing him to take a chance on a song he did not believe in. She was not his manager, she was not his agent, but she was the closest person to him when the biggest decisions were being made, and she knew the real man beneath the costume. Then, the Gail Davis chapter arrived, and Ina May felt the weight of it settle over her life like something she could never lift. She stayed anyway, for nearly 48 years total. That number tells its own story. Endurance, pride, stubbornness, a love that refuses to quit even when it probably should. They had no children. That detail hung over the marriage like an unanswered question. No sons to carry the name. No daughters to inherit the story. Just two people in a house that kept getting bigger and quieter. Ina May died of cancer on May 19, 1980. Gene was 72. People who knew him said her death broke something that could not be repaired. He withdrew. He grieved alone. After decades of fame and millions of fans, Gene Autry was alone in a way that no wealth or applause could touch. The woman who had seen him before any of it existed was gone, and whatever she knew, whatever she carried that she never said publicly, went with her. The boy who learned to hide early. Now we go backward, because the roots of Gene Autry's double life do not begin in Hollywood. They do not start with Gail Davis, or with fame, or money, or temptation. They start in a place so far removed from the movie business that you would never think to look there unless someone told you to. His real name was not even Gene, it was Orvon. Orvon Grover Autry. He was born on September 29, 1907, near Tioga, in Grayson County, Texas. He came from a poor farming family, not working class, not getting by. Poor. The kind of poor where you feel it every single day and you never quite stop feeling it even after the money finally shows up decades later. His father, Delbert Autry, worked as a horse trader. That sounds romantic in a cowboy movie, but in real life it meant unpredictable income, broken deals, dry months, and the constant anxiety of not knowing whether next week would bring $1 or nothing at all. His mother, Elnora Osment, was sick for much of her life, so the household Gene grew up in was not warm and steady and safe. It was a place with worry built right into the foundation. His grandfather, William T. Autry, was a strict Baptist preacher. That meant church services, hymns, rigid rules, and heavy lessons about right and wrong were a constant presence in Gene's early world. There was no room for softness, no room for excuses. You held yourself together, and you followed the rules no matter what was happening behind closed doors. The family drifted between Texas and Oklahoma searching for something better. They lived near Achilles, then later near Ravia in Johnston County, Oklahoma. Every move brought a new struggle instead of a new start. And then came the thing that must have shaped Gene more than almost anything else. Around 1918, when he was about 11 years old, his father Delbert was arrested and sent to prison for bootlegging. He served roughly 2 years. Try to picture that for a moment. You are 11. You live in a small rural community where everybody knows everybody else's business, and your father is locked up. Not for something anyone could mistake as heroic or noble. For bootlegging, for breaking the law in the most common, unglamorous way possible. The shame of that for a kid in that time and that place would have been crushing, especially a kid being raised under the moral authority of a Baptist preacher grandfather. Gene had to grow up fast after that. He was doing farm labor by the time he was 6. By 1921, he was shining shoes and sweeping barbershop floors for pennies. He stacked hay on farms and punishing heat. This was not a childhood. This was just survival with a boy's face on it. And here is where the psychology of Gene Autry's entire life starts to click into place. A boy who watched his father go to prison. A boy who grew up with a sick mother, an unstable income, and the constant awareness that the ground beneath his feet could give way at any moment. What does that boy want more than anything else in the world when he finally gets the chance to build his own life? Control. He wants control over the story people tell about him. He wants to construct an image so clean, so upright, so bulletproof that nobody can ever look at him the way his neighbors looked at his family when his father was taken away in front of everyone. The Cowboy Code was not just a marketing tool for children. It was the life Gene Autry wished he had been born into. It was the father he wished he had grown up with. The stability he never once felt as a child. The honor that was missing from his earliest and most formative memories. He did not just create a character for the cameras, he built the man he desperately wished he could actually be. And when he fell short of that man, when the drinking crept in, when the affair with Gail Davis took hold, the distance between who Gene Autry really was and who the public believed him to be became its own kind of prison. One he could never escape because he had built it himself. The $8 guitar in the first door out. Before that prison of fame took shape though, there was a key. A small, cheap, beautiful key that opened the very first door Gene Autry ever walked through by his own choice. It was around 1919. Gene was about 12 years old, working on his Uncle Calvin's farm, stacking hay bales for roughly 5 cents each. On a hard day, he could push through 100 bales. He was a child doing work that would break grown men. And he saved the money. $8 exactly. For a family as poor as the Autrys, $8 could have gone to food or supplies or any of the 100 urgent needs that were never fully met. But Gene ordered a guitar from the Sears Roebuck catalog instead. That was the real turning point. Not the movies, not the radio deal. A 12-year-old boy deciding that survival alone was not enough. He wanted something of his own, something nobody else controlled. His mother had already introduced him to music through church hymns and psalms at home. Singing was familiar. But the guitar made it personal. He started playing at a little cafe in Tavian and at school events. By his mid-teens, he was earning about $1 a night in tips. That might sound like nothing, but for a kid who had been shining shoes for pocket change, $1 a night from music was a revelation. It proved that his voice and his hands could produce income on their own terms. Later on, in Ravia, he played in drugstores and small evening spots. He listened carefully to the radio and absorbed the styles of other performers, especially the yodeling technique made famous by Jimmy Rogers. Music gradually shifted from being just an emotional escape to being a genuine path forward. And the most important thing about that path was simple. Gene chose it himself. On the farm, he was just another pair of hands doing whatever work somebody else assigned. With the guitar in his lap and people actually stopping to listen, he had something that belonged entirely to him. Not inherited, not borrowed, not dependent on whether his father was free or locked up or chasing a deal that might never come through. The guitar was his, the songs were his, the attention was his, and he held on to that feeling for the rest of his life. The night a stranger changed everything. In 1925, Gene walked away from home with a high school diploma and whatever grit 18 years of hardship had built inside him. He took a job as a telegraph operator for the St. Louis and San Francisco Railway in Chelsea, Oklahoma, earning about $35 a month. Steady, honest, forgettable work. But those night shifts were empty. To fight the silence, Gene would strum his guitar and sing at the desk. Sometimes he yodeled just to stay awake. The habit got him in trouble more than once, but it also produced one of those rare moments that redirect an entire life. Sometime between 1926 and 1928, a man walked in to send a telegram. He heard Gene singing. He stopped, listened, and told him that a voice like that belonged on the radio, not hidden behind telegraph wires. The man was Will Rogers, the most famous humorist in America. Gene held on to that comment like a lifeline. In 1928, he went to New York chasing his break. It collapsed. No work, no money, no luck. He came home broke and embarrassed. But Gene had spent his entire childhood watching plans fall apart. He knew how to keep going. By late 1928 or early 1929, he was singing on KVOO radio in Tulsa as a yodeling cowboy. His crowds grew fast, sometimes reaching 1,000 or more at live events. His weekly pay climbed to between $50 and $100. Will Rogers did not hand him a career. He handed him something more valuable: permission to believe the talent was real. The song that opened every door. Gene's first shot at New York had crumbled, but the city was not done with him. In autumn 1928, he auditioned for the Victor Talking Machine Company. Director Nathaniel Shilkret did not turn him away for lack of talent. Victor had simply already signed 2 similar artists. But Shilkret gave him real advice: go sing on radio, build your following, come back later. Gene listened. On October 9, 1929, he recorded tracks in New York with Jimmy Long, just 20 days before the stock market crashed and the Great Depression swallowed America whole. In 1929, he signed with Columbia Records and began appearing on WLS-AM's National Barn Dance in Chicago, where he met Smiley Burnette. In those early years, Gene's sound was rougher than the polished cowboy music people would later associate with him. He recorded hillbilly songs, blues-influenced tracks, even a labor anthem called The Death of Mother Jones. Then in 1931, Gene and Jimmy Long recorded That Silver-Haired Daddy of Mine. The song was drenched in family, regret, and longing. During the worst years of the Depression, when millions of families could barely keep food on the table, a song about loving your parents and wishing you could undo the pain you caused them hit a nerve so deep it ran through the whole country. It sold roughly 500,000 copies and kept growing through re-releases and film appearances. Gene was no longer a regional radio act. He was becoming a national voice. People connected with him because he sounded like one of them. Not privileged, not distant, worn out and heartbroken and still standing. That connection was the foundation beneath everything else, and it was genuine. But as fame grew, the distance between who he was publicly and who he was privately grew right along with it. When the studio said he was finished, Gene entered Hollywood in 1934 through producer Nat Levine at Mascot Pictures. He and Smiley Burnette debuted in Old Santa Fe, and Gene soon landed his first lead in the 1935 serial The Phantom Empire. When Mascot merged into Republic Pictures, Gene came along and made 44 films by 1940. Low budget, every one of them. But audiences did not care about production values. They cared about Gene. By 1940, he was Republic's top star. Then he pushed for better pay. He was earning around $3,500 per picture and knew he deserved more. Studio boss Herbert J. Yates refused. When Gene finished The Old Barn Dance, Yates let him walk, and he had a replacement standing by. A young singer named Leonard Sly, who had appeared in Gene's films with the Sons of the Pioneers, was repackaged as Roy Rogers and slotted into Gene's old schedule. For a moment, it looked like Gene Autry might be yesterday's headline. But Gene understood something most performers did not. Depending on one studio was the same as depending on one horse trader deal in rural Oklahoma. If the deal falls through, you starve. He threw himself into radio, records, and live rodeo. He built the Flying A Ranch rodeo operation on 1,200 acres near Ardmore, Oklahoma. The nearby town of Berwyn renamed itself Gene Autry, Oklahoma, on November 16, 1941. About 35,000 people attended the ceremony, broadcast live on Melody Ranch. He was bigger than any single contract, and that instinct, that refusal to be owned, would define everything that followed. The cowboy who went to war for real. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and Gene did something Hollywood did not see coming. On July 26, 1942, he enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps. He was 35, the maximum draft age. He was earning approximately $600,000 a year, and he walked away from every cent. Fans heard him take the oath live on Melody Ranch from Luke Field in Arizona. Republic wanted him doing safe public relations work. Gene refused. His pay dropped to $125 a month. While he served, Republic kept reissuing his old films and building Roy Rogers. Gene earned his service pilot rating in June 1944 and flew C-109 transport planes on one of the war's deadliest routes, the Hump, the airlift corridor over the Himalayas between India and China. Pilots faced extreme weather, high-altitude turbulence, and the constant threat of engine failure over brutal terrain. Gene Autry, the smiling cowboy who sang lullabies to children, flew those missions. This chapter mattered because it complicated every easy judgment about the man. Whatever contradictions lived in his private life, Gene did not fake his military service. He gave up a fortune and placed himself in real danger. Nobody forced him. He chose it. And that made Gene Autry impossible to reduce to simple terms. Courageous and reckless, generous and selfish, honorable in one room and deceptive in the next. The cowboy who thought like a tycoon. After the war, Gene's business mind shifted into a gear that startled even people who thought they knew him. In 1947, he left Republic for Columbia Pictures with his own production unit, replacing Smiley Burnett with Pat Buttram, who would appear in over 40 films and 100 television episodes alongside him. In 1951, he formed Flying A Productions and took Republic to federal court over television rights to 54 of his old films. The Supreme Court did not fully side with Gene, but the fight proved how clearly he understood the television economy before almost anyone else in the industry. By the late 1960s, when Republic was fading, Gene bought back his own film rights and negatives, giving him control over every future format. He started Challenge Records in the late 1950s. Its biggest hit, Tequila by the Champs in 1958, helped spark the rock and roll instrumental craze. He invested in hotels and real estate. By 1964, he owned the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco, the Hotel Continental in Hollywood, the Sahara Inn near Chicago, and property in Palm Springs. His media empire included radio stations across the Golden West Network. In 1982, he sold KTLA in Los Angeles for $245 million. Then came baseball. When Major League Baseball planned an expansion team in Los Angeles in 1960, Gene originally wanted radio broadcast rights. League officials were so impressed they pushed him to become the owner instead. The franchise debuted as the Los Angeles Angels in 1961, later became the California Angels, and Gene served as American League vice president from 1983 until his death. In 1995, he sold a quarter share to the Walt Disney Company, then a controlling interest the following year. Gene Autry had turned a cowboy image into one of the largest personal fortunes in American entertainment. Films, records, television, radio stations, hotels, a baseball team, rodeo operations, toy licensing, and real estate. But the one thing all that money could not buy was the thing missing from every room he walked into. He and Ina May never had children, and no amount of business success could fill that quiet. The last chapter nobody saw coming. When Ina May passed in 1980, Gene was gutted. He withdrew from the world. The loneliness was visible to everyone around him. The man who had spent decades surrounded by fans and flashbulbs and business partners was suddenly, painfully alone. Then, just 14 months later, he remarried. On July 19, 1981, Gene married Jacqueline Elam, known as Jackie, at a church in Burbank. Gene was 73. Jackie was 39. The 34-year age gap drew immediate attention and raised questions. Jackie had first met Gene back in 1964 at Security Pacific Bank in Palm Springs, where she had worked her way from switchboard operator to vice president by age 32. Their first date was around New Year's Eve 1979. Gene was so nervous he invited her to bring a friend along. Like his first marriage, the second produced no children. The honors kept arriving. Country Music Hall of Fame in 1969, Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1970, Hall of Great Western Performers in 1972, American Patriots Medal in 1977, Oklahoma Hall of Fame in 1991, and always those 5 stars on the Walk of Fame that nobody else has ever matched. Gene Autry died on October 2, 1998 at his home in Studio City, Los Angeles. Lymphoma. He had turned 91 just 3 days earlier. Forbes ranked him among America's 400 wealthiest people. Jackie became the primary steward of the Autry name, protecting and expanding the Autry Museum of the American West. But even that legacy stirred debate. In 2001, the American Indian movement planned a boycott over a possible Autry Museum and Southwest Museum alliance, showing that Gene's version of the West still carried power and still raised uncomfortable questions. So what was the truth? Here is what we actually know. Gene Autry grew up poor in a family soaked in shame. His father went to prison. His mother was chronically ill. He learned before he was old enough to understand the lesson that the world was not safe, not stable, and definitely not fair. And from that cracked and unsteady soil, he grew an image so clean and so airtight that an entire nation trusted it for the better part of a century. He wrote a code for children that he could not follow himself. He told them to always be honest while hiding an affair that lasted years. He told them to stay clean in thought and action while fighting a battle with alcohol that cost him sponsors and dignity. He told them to respect women while his own wife carried the quiet weight of his betrayals. But he also served his country when nobody asked him to, and nothing forced his hand. He walked away from $600,000 a year to fly dangerous wartime missions over mountains that killed other pilots. He built businesses that employed thousands of people. He created music that brought genuine comfort and joy to millions of families during some of the hardest years in American history. He made Christmas sound the way Christmas is supposed to sound. So was Gene Autry a good man? That depends entirely on which Gene Autry you are asking about. The one on the screen was flawless. The one behind the screen was human. Deeply, painfully, contradictingly human. And Gail Davis? She was not a villain. She was a talented, educated, hard-working woman who got pulled into the gravitational field of a man who was simply too powerful and too complicated to resist easily. She gave children a hero in Annie Oakley. She earned her place in Western entertainment on her own ability. And the private chapter of her life that involved Gene Autry was just one chapter in a much longer and more complete story. If there is a real lesson buried inside all of this, it is not that heroes are frauds. It is that the people we place the most trust in are very often the ones fighting the hardest wars inside themselves. The white hat was real. The Cowboy Code was real. The desire to be good, to be worthy of trust, to live up to something higher than himself. All of that was real. Gene Autry meant every word of it. He just could not get there all the way. And maybe that is the most honest thing you can say about any person who ever lived. He tried. He failed. He kept trying. And the song never stopped playing. If this story stayed with you today, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who remembers those old westerns, someone who grew up humming Rudolph or watching Annie Oakley on a Saturday morning. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next story we bring you. And drop a comment below telling us what you honestly think. Was Gene Autry a hero who stumbled? Or was the whole cowboy image just a beautiful lie that lasted longer than most? We will see you next time.